Hi, the managing editor of Four on the Rocks. You're listening to Horns of a Dilemma. In this episode, how have recent nuclear posture reviews, which outline the role nuclear weapons play in U.S. national security strategy, addressed the question of strategic stability? Here to talk about it is Sharon Weiner, associate professor at American University and currently a visiting research scholar at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School. Dr. Weiner previously served at the Office of Management and Budget, in the office of Senator Al Franken, the House Armed Services Committee, and more. We hope you enjoy the episode.
All right, hello everybody. Welcome to, I think for many of you, the beginning of the semester, I understand. I always think of this as the period where you have the illusion of maximum control over your lives. It'll end shortly, but be happy for now. And everybody else, thanks. I understand there's some folks who aren't looking forward to class later on this afternoon who are here too. So appreciate the invitation. It's nice to be here. And so what I'm going to talk today about is the notion of strategic stability in nuclear relationships. In particular, I'm going to talk about strategic stability and the consequences that result from the Obama administration's nuclear posture review and also the Trump administration's nuclear posture review. And I'm going to try and convince you of, well, actually, three goals. One is to convince you that the current nuclear posture that comes from the Trump administration's NPR will experience problems or can contribute to problems with strategic stability that the Obama administration's nuclear posture review, hey Ellen, probably wouldn't, okay? And the second thing I want to convince you of is that this is not because the two nuclear posture reviews and the force structures they lead to are substantially different, because they're actually not. Instead, what I've done is look at a variety of other contexts within which these strategic choices will be implemented. And in particular, today I'm going to focus on the bureaucratic context. And I'm going to make the argument that the bureaucratic context and the evolution of decision-making, nuclear decision-making, has created potential problems with strategic stability that combine with the Trump nuclear posture in a way that wasn't true for the Obama review. And this is part of a larger project, which I call the social construction of deterrence, which looks at nuclear requirements. And for those on the podcast, I put my fingers up in parentheses here. Things that we claim to be required of our nuclear force structure, but which are actually choices among many rational choices. And the larger project looks at how social, political, and bureaucratic contexts create things which we come to think of as requirements, when in fact they were simply choices. And so I'm looking forward to your comments, criticism, feedback as part of that larger project as well, okay? But today the smaller part is strategic stability. So the first thing we need to do, what do we mean by strategic stability? So I'm kind of an old school deterrence person. Strategic stability I'm going to define in the basic way you would have used it in the 1950s. And there's two parts to that. One is crisis stability. This means that in the event of a crisis, you don't look at me and get scared and think, my gosh, I better launch my nukes now before she does something. And therefore you would preempt or you would launch a preventative strike. The other form of strategic stability is general stability, and that's in a general deterrent relationship. There's not an incentive for an arms race, okay? The goal here is that both sides of the equation can behave in a way that is modest, predictable, and disinclined towards crises, that takes into account misunderstandings, misperceptions, and where there's less of a chance of things like launch under a mistaken problem, early launch, preventative war, preemptive war, etc. Okay, so strategic stability, that's how I'm defining it. In nuclear history in the United States, strategic stability, what causes it and what creates problems for it, has actually varied over time. And in some cases, the thing today that promotes stability actually some time ago promoted instability. So there's obviously a larger context to the interpretation of this idea. So the easiest place to see this is in missile defense. In 1972, the US and Soviet Union talked about a treaty to ban missile defenses because missile defenses were destabilizing, right? If I can protect my population, you can't hurt them with your nuclear weapons. And so if you know I can protect my population, you kind of wonder what I'm doing under that shield, that I might actually launch an attack at you, a first strike. And so therefore, that situation is unstable because you look at me and think, okay, anything she does that looks out of the ordinary or possibly concerning might mean a first strike, so you have an incentive to preempt. Okay, so missile defenses were considered destabilizing for this reason. Fast forward, under Ronald Reagan, strategic stability and missile defense go hand in hand because Reagan argued we don't have to be worried about a bolt from the blue. We don't have to be worried about damage from a first strike because we will have a missile defense shield. It will protect us. It means that U.S. response can wait, can see, and can be more moderate. Okay. That tends to be the same argument that's made today about missile defenses. And the Russians, instead of the Soviets, say, you got to be kidding. We don't trust you and what you're doing back there. This is missile defense as a shield for you to get strategic advantage on us. So there are different cultural interpretations, different national interpretations about strategic stability. But missile defense is just one area where one technology in one political, social, bureaucratic context is destabilizing, only becomes stabilizing later. And the larger project looks at a lot of these things, secure second strikes, damage limitation, a variety of different nuclear issues. But today's strategic stability. So, nuclear posture review. The Obama administration did one early on. They did a mini nuclear posture review at the end of 2 years. Trump administration did one right when it took office. All of these nuclear posture reviews lead to specific plans for nuclear force structure. I mean, you have to have plans to understand what nuclear weapons are you going to buy, right? Okay. So the Obama administration created plans for a force structure that also took into account the fact that most U.S. nuclear weapons hadn't been modernized for decades. And in some cases, they were not quite falling apart, but there were arguments that they needed to be either improved for safety and security issues, improved for use, functionality issues, and improved because there were new ways of producing and dealing with things that made them safer and better. So the Obama Nuclear Posture Review produced a modernization plan which modernizes literally every part of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. So there are plans to replace the current system of ICBMs, land-based ballistic missiles, with something called GBSD. It's the ground-based strategic deterrent. It's a really modest is almost too big of a word to say improvement over the current system. It's better off to think of it as simply a generational replacement. Okay. It's the same plan under the Trump Nuclear Posture Review. So ICBM modernization, ballistic missile submarine modernization. Current class of submarines is being replaced by something called the Columbia class. Both administrations plan to buy 12 boats, same number of missile tubes. Again, modest more accurately describes, I think, the improvements and innovations of the Columbia class over the current class of nuclear submarines. But again, not a huge difference. But the plan's the same under both Obama and Trump, okay? ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, subs, and then we have bombers that deliver airplanes. The Obama Nuclear Posture Review supported something called the B-21 Raider, which is a new fighter bomber that the Air Force has said, you know, even if we didn't have nukes, we would still want to buy these things in the same quantities. Same plan under the Trump administration. So there you've got the three legs of the triad, essentially the exact same thing under both administrations. The other part of this, though, that's also the same is, in addition to the weapons, the platforms that deliver weapons, the bombers, the submarines, the ICBMs, you've got the actual bombs on board. And so the Obama administration approved a modernization plan that would literally replace, I have to be careful about language here because it technically replace suggests new, will extend the life, it's called the Life Extension Program, of every warhead in the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Okay? And there are actually legitimate arguments about whether extend the life means creating a new nuclear weapon in some cases or just simply a different version of the previously existing nuclear weapons. So there are plans to do a life extension program on every single nuclear warhead in the arsenal, except for one, and that life extension program was already completed, so you didn't have to do it again. Same under Trump, same under Obama. The only significant differences between the nuclear structures to come out of each administration have to do with low-yield nuclear weapons. So these are weapons that have it may be between a portion of a kiloton up through a few kiloton range, as opposed to the really big nuclear weapons. So sometimes, let me back up here. So these small nuclear weapons are sometimes referred to as tactical nuclear weapons. The word now is non-strategic. The best way to think about this is they're small, okay? They're smaller nuclear weapons. What else was I going to say there? Sometimes you can also think of part of these things as being delivered by cruise missiles. So in contrast to a ballistic missile that goes up into the atmosphere and down again, it's a cruise missile that flies along the Earth. More typically, you would be delivering these things in a battle situation as opposed to a large deterrent situation. But the argument from both administrations is that you need small-scale nuclear weapons and cruise missiles because it's important to deter at every level of conflict. The argument is if you can't use limited nuclear strikes, then your enemy could take advantage of you. And the counter-argument is that once you use a limited nuclear strike, you're going to inherently connect that to escalation, and that in reality, any limited nuclear strike in practice is going to lead to mutually assured destruction or massive retaliation. Okay. Now, don't want to get into those arguments about cruise missiles. The point here is that both the Obama and the Trump administration had them. The one they have in common is called LRSO, the long-range standoff weapon, it's an air-launched cruise missile. To this, the Trump administration has added a new sea launch, or returning a sea launch cruise missile. It's the very same missile we think that the Obama administration eliminated because they said we only needed one of these things. So one key difference is the Trump people are bringing back another sea launch cruise missile. The other key difference is that the Trump administration is replacing a few, we don't know how many, warheads on submarine-launched missiles with low-yield options. And I believe the first one of these was produced actually just last week. Okay, a few. Started production, yeah. So just a few of these things. So that's a second difference. The third difference is, this has to do with megaton weapons. The Obama administration had decided it would retire something called the B-83, which is the last megaton nuclear weapon in the U.S. arsenal. And the Trump administration has instead said, let's keep that and think about a replacement. Okay. Aside from these differences in a low-yield subweapon, a submarine-launched cruise missile, and the B-83, the force structures to come out of Obama and Trump are essentially the same force structure recommendations. Okay. If you pay taxes, I encourage you to pay attention to this modernization because the latest cost estimate is somewhere around $1.7 trillion for the next 40 years. And if you look at the history of cost overruns in the Defense Department, and especially in the part of the government that makes warheads, it's probably a lot more than that. And there are also reasons there's not really a commercial industry for making nuclear weapons, thank goodness. We also haven't made them for decades, so you got to not necessarily reinvent, although in some cases reinvent, but reconstitute and bring up an industry infrastructure and a set of suppliers to do these things. So there are other reasons why costs go up and why cost estimation is difficult. But you're also dealing with two agencies who have a history of really big problems estimating costs. I did a little calculation the other day. Calculation sounds fancy. Actually there was some division in there too. Woo! Trying to look at the cost of something that's projected initially at $10 billion. This is a program to enrich uranium. And I went in and looked at the agency that's responsible for this and the big projects of this caliber that they've done and looked at the cost overruns. They were between 450 and 970%. So that tells you what that $10 billion estimate is going to be. All right. So anyway, expensive. All right. Initially, same nuclear force structures. I'm going to make three arguments about why strategic stability is problematic now when it wasn't necessarily during the Obama administration. The first argument is about the line between conventional and nuclear use. The second argument is about whether or not the U.S. is engaged in and interested in the future arms reduction or making more nuclear weapons. And the third argument is actually about oversight and how much external or how much criticism an option gets before it actually becomes policy. Right? All three of these arguments are based upon an understanding and analysis of the bureaucracy, okay? And that context as it applies to strategic stability. So number one, the line between conventional and nuclear weapons. The US, throughout its history, has always treated nuclear weapons as if we wanted small-scale options that could be used along with conventional weapons, and in some cases might actually be included in the plans. We've always talked about this. For example, under Eisenhower, nuclear weapons were just another weapon. They were incorporated, at least verbally, into the war plans. The plan was to use them at the same time. We only, however, had really big nuclear weapons, megaton nuclear weapons. And using a megaton nuclear weapon on a battlefield, if your goal is to get rid of the battlefield, it's got you covered. If your goal is maybe to actually take territory, using big nukes is a bad idea. All right? So in the 1960s, the US came up with a notion of something called flexible response. And this was based upon a concern that the Soviet Union wouldn't be deterred from using nuclear weapons just because we had big ones, that they would actually peck around the edges of American interests and try and defeat us in small-scale, little individual activities, none of which were worthy of Armageddon, but which collectively would have an impact on the American way of life. And so the argument was we needed small-scale nuclear weapons and flexible response as a doctrine. And this has been the argument ever since then. Well, if you look at the work of Francis Gavin based on newly declassified documents, you'll see that what we say about flexible response and what we actually did were two different things. Right? So Gavin's work shows that up until the late 1990s, there were no really flexible options in the US nuclear war plans. Any option for using a small number of nuclear weapons quickly escalated to include the equivalent of mutually assured destruction, maybe not mutually assured destruction, but major attack options, lots of nuclear weapons. And part of this was due to the planning by which we use nuclear weapons at then Strategic Air Command. The upshot was, until the late 1990s, if the president had said, give me your limited nuclear options for dealing with Korea, for all practical purposes, there were no limited options for dealing with North Korea. There were only massive options for dealing with North Korea. Well, in the late 1990s, after the Cold War, several things changed. In particular, there was a head of Strategic Command named General Lee Butler. And he went into the nuclear war planning and tried to scrub the planning and the targeting plans to remove redundancy, to increase coordination between services, to try and make sense of nuclear weapons targeting in the post-Cold War environment. And so the argument is, after that process, there were more limited options, and even perhaps more importantly, there was an increasing ability to adapt the war plans over a shorter period of time. So he embraced something called adaptive planning, which was also embraced by the conventional military. Adaptive planning is the notion that instead of only having things on the shelf, which then take you a very long time to modify because you have rigid rules and relationships, you adopt a set of planning mechanisms that allows you to respond in a quicker fashion to changes and to requests. So as a result of Butler's changes, so we're told, not only were there more small options, but Strategic Command was more capable of adapting quickly and coming up with more of them at the request of leaders. Previously, it would take up to close to a year and a half to change any major attack option in the nuclear world. So this was a big shift. The other thing, though, that happened is in the Obama administration, in 2013, according to analysis by Hans Christensen, the Obama administration issued a new defense planning guidance that called for more limited nuclear options. And part of the push from the Obama administration was that he was getting criticism from people who were more politically aligned with him, but who are anti-nuclear, or who are at least interested in a more responsible nuclear policy, for something called dangers about launch on warning. So the argument was the president's sitting in the Oval Office, having a great day. You get a phone call that says there are incoming ICBMs. What do you want to do? And the president would be given 3 options, each of which would go, in theory, from a lot to a lot plus more to a whole lot of stuff. And then instead what Obama wanted was something that said, you know what, let me use a few and wait. Can you do that for me? And so in 2013, the Defense Planning Guidance instructed Strategic Command to come up with limited options. Okay? And the argument is that based upon the changes made in when Butler was head of Strategic Command, they actually did. So today, President Trump can go into the Oval Office, and he may want limited options. In the past, they really wouldn't necessarily have existed, or it would have been hard to construct them, much harder, and there would have been a period of wait and see. But today, the chances are those options are either present or more readily available. And to the extent that they're present and more readily available, that encourages their use. Okay? And if the Russians see this and understand this consequence, they may then be tempted to preempt, because they will think the U.S. is tempted to cross the nuclear line first or earlier in a crisis. And keep in mind that also the logic of deterrence means any limited nuclear strike carries with it the threat that if you don't behave, we're going to do a bigger nuclear strike, right? So there's this implicit threat of escalation, okay, which becomes then difficult to control. So the argument is because there are more limited options, they're more readily available, and they're more easily generated, that blurs the line between the relationship between nuclear weapons and conventional warfare. Oh, I should also add in, starting in February of 2018, the regional combatant commanders are also allowed to now incorporate nuclear weapons in their attack options, whereas previously nuclear war planning belonged to Strategic Command. Now, at least according to the Defense News media, more places that don't think of themselves as actually strictly nuclear can include nuclear weapons in the things they plan to do. All right? So that's argument 1. All right? Argument 2 is simply called more. Arms races, strategic instability, come when you think your enemy is going to build up in a way that actually might disadvantage you. And so you're encouraged to respond to that in kind. So if you look at the Trump Nuclear Posture Review and the weapons programs that come out of it, the modernization agenda, you'll find baked into those plans, and they're starting to become visible now in the budget requests, are several things that will establish the infrastructure to actually make more nuclear weapons in the future. And I'll point out just 3 of these things. 1, enriched uranium. Enriched uranium is used in nuclear weapons. Enriched uranium is used to produce a gas called tritium, which is used in nuclear weapons. Highly enriched uranium is used to propel naval carriers and submarines. The U.S. has a limited supply of enriched uranium. We stopped enriching uranium at the end of the Cold War. Actually, we stopped enriching uranium for weapons purposes in 1964 because we thought it would have a good effect on the international community and would discourage the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Okay. Today we can't, for all practical purposes, we do not enrich uranium for nuclear weapons. We can't enrich uranium for nuclear weapons. We don't have a domestic uranium enrichment capacity. And the argument is, well, we should build one, right? And under the Obama administration, the argument was that eventually we're going to run out of supplies of this gas, tritium, which is used to boost nuclear weapons. And that after that, we're also going to run out of the highly enriched uranium that's used to propel Navy craft, right? Under the Obama administration, the argument was made that, well, you need to prove that when we're going to run out of these things is actually when you say, and maybe we should postpone construction of this domestic uranium enrichment capacity. A little later, maybe we can wait, because right now the most pressing need is for tritium, and we recycle materials. We use materials that were previously declared excess. the agency responsible for this, which is the National Nuclear Security Administration, found additional materials available in other places. They pushed out the timeline a little bit, but now they're arguing that by about 2040, we need to be in a place to make enriched uranium. Otherwise, we won't have enough to create tritium. All right. And if you're interested in that process, we can go into it later on, but that's the short version. Okay. Under the Obama administration, they said, you know what, let's wait and see. Let's think about alternatives. Let's try and decide what we want to do. We need NNSA to make a justification for what they want to do. And at the time, there were two arguments. One was that we should develop a domestic enrichment capacity based on a centrifuge called the AC-100, which was originally developed in cooperation with the US government for the big rejuvenation of the nuclear fuel industry in the United States, the commercial nuclear energy sector, which actually never happened. Right? It's a fancy centrifuge, it's big, it can enrich a lot of uranium. The other alternative was a very small centrifuge, which would be geared just towards making, enriching uranium for defense purposes. So not huge capacity, but small capacity. Obama administration didn't make a decision about any of this, and the Trump administration has decided that it will fund the AC-100, the fancy centrifuge, and invest in an enrichment capacity, right? So you can't argue that if you have nuclear weapons, you need enriched uranium. You need tritium to support them. There are reasonable arguments about the deadline by which you need this, and there's also an argument that says, you know, in the future, if you get rid of some nuclear weapons and you have further arms control reductions, you would have more of this material that you could cannibalize, and you wouldn't need to create a uranium enrichment process right now. You could also argue that getting back into the enrichment business sends a sign to other countries that the US is more interested in nuclear weapons in the future and less interested in abiding by commitments under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to eventually get rid of them. But in particular, if you look at the AC-100 as the basis for your uranium enrichment capacity, you could also imagine that over a few years, you would have the ability not just to replace the materials you need now, but to make a whole lot more. And it's that making a whole lot more that your adversaries might look at and say, when I combine this with the rhetoric of the Trump administration, I now worry that not only are they not committed to arms control, but they're actually interested in building more nuclear weapons. You can see the same story with the production of pits, which are the primary at the core of the explosion of a nuclear weapon. The US right now, we lost our last pit production facility in the 1980s at Rocky Flats, Colorado. They shut down because they were, shall we say, not very careful with what they did with their radioactive materials. So they were shut down. The US hasn't been able to really produce pits in any number since then. And according to reports periodically, we can produce maybe a couple of a year. There are arguments that push that up a little bit and push it down a little bit, but not very much. They're made at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. Okay. If you're going to periodically replace nuclear weapons, if you're going to come up with a significantly new design for nuclear weapons, if you're concerned that your current nuclear weapons are based on pits that are aging and have problems with that, which, by the way, is a debate, all those reasons say you need to produce pits. All right? The question is, how many do you need to produce? Well, thankfully, Congress stepped in, passed a law that said, 80 pits per year. Okay? And there are arguments about 80 pits per year. Okay? Under the Obama administration, when NNSA submitted its plans to produce nuclear weapons pits, the Obama administration said, okay, we need a bigger justification for why you want to do this. The plan was to make them at Los Alamos National Laboratory. It's a very expensive project. And the argument was, well, we need better analysis of why you're going to do this. Okay, fast forward to the Trump administration. Now the plan is to build a pit production facility at Los Alamos and a second pit production facility at Savannah River in a large building that has been repurposed from a non-proliferation project. And so the concern is that both of these facilities together can make not just 80 pits per year, but a lot more than that. And so again, if you're concerned about an arms race, you look at PIP production and you worry that the current US program is leading to a whole lot more than just what you need to take care of the current arsenal. The last thing, which is really not a project, but is an idea about how you use the hedge. Right? Under the New START Treaty, the U.S. is allowed 1,500 or so nuclear weapons, but both the U.S. and other countries maintain additional nuclear weapons in something called the hedge. Okay? So this is a category of nuclear weapons that are everything from just waiting to be dismantled and gotten rid of, to in various stages of almost readiness. Some of them would take years, some of them would take months, some of them would take less time than that. Okay? According to analysis by Hans Christensen of the Federation of American Scientists, we have about 3,000 or so nuclear weapons in the hedge, give or take. The exact number is classified. So the Obama administration said, you know, all those nuclear weapons, we need to get rid of some of those, right? If we're committed to a world without nuclear weapons, let's focus on the hedge and figure out how can we get rid of all the weapons that are sitting there, right? Now, they accepted the argument, and this has been the consistent rationale for the hedge, that you actually need some extra for two reasons. One, geopolitical uncertainty. Suddenly, in the Bahamas, there's a massive nuclear building project, and they suddenly have a huge arsenal. Okay? First of all, I'm going to investigate. It's going to take a long time. The second is, let's say that in one of the life extension programs you've done for a current class of warheads, that it turns out you made a mistake and there's a catastrophic failure in all of them and they all turn to Swiss cheese. Okay? So you would want things in the hedge that you could go to in case you're wrong about how you've dealt with the future, which is inherently uncertain. So the Obama administration said, to reduce the hedge, we're going to invest in something called the interoperable warhead. Right? When we talked about nuclear modernization, I talked about there being ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. They carry different warheads, and you can't swap them out. So the interoperable warhead was intended to be one warhead you could use on both platforms. So then in the hedge, you would need extra copies of that one warhead, and you could replace it on either platform. Whereas currently today, you need extra copies of everything that's on both sides of it, which means more in the hedge. Okay, so this was the argument by the Obama administration. And they saw the hedge as something that, in the name of arms control and nonproliferation, we needed to do our best to reduce it. The Trump administration talks about it differently. They talk about it as a reservoir of extras that we can reconstitute in the event that the world turns out to be a different place than we think it is. So the rate of getting rid of things in the hedge was never high under Obama. Quite frankly, partially that's due to Republicans in Congress who wouldn't approve the funding for dismantlement. But it's gotten even less so under the Trump administration. And the Trump administration has also indicated it's no longer interested in this interoperable warhead. The Navy wasn't really interested in it either. But all of these things together suggest that the idea of the hedge is now not something that you're trying to get rid of or minimize, but it's actually something you should invest in and take care of and maintain, because it's the basis of your ability to have more nuclear weapons. Okay. So domestic uranium enrichment, PIP production, and the hedge all suggest that the U.S., should it want to in the future, could actually make more nuclear weapons at some time, that we're investing in this capability and infrastructure to do this. Okay, the last argument is about the analysis and criticism that is applied to decisions before they're made, right? Under the Obama administration, it was harder to invest in nuclear modernization projects because of the decision-making structure and the funding structure for funding nuclear modernization. Two things in particular. 2011, Congress passes something called the Budget Control Act. There's this debate in Congress. Some of you remember this group of Congress folks called the Tea Party. They're elected on the basis of fiscal concerns that the U.S. shouldn't have deficit spending. Disagreements between them and the Obama administration about the role of the deficit, but also about the benefits of national security versus social spending, result in this Budget Control Act, part of which says every dollar what you spend on defense has to be matched by what you spend on non-defense, or you have to increase taxes. So it basically creates a system where all the money you spend on nuclear modernization has to come either from within the existing budgets, because there are budget caps with this Budget Control Act, or you can increase social spending, which Congress didn't want to do, or you can prioritize things within the Defense Department, or within national security spending, 95% of which is within the Defense Department. So what this meant is that the cost of all of these modernization programs came at the cost of things that the Defense Department could possibly do in the conventional world. And in most cases, these were higher priorities for the Defense Department. The other problem that came into play, I had mentioned this National Nuclear Security Administration, NNSA, and some of their projects that went 900 and some odd % over the initial cost estimates. Well, every time that happened, you were faced with the choice of either canceling the project or taking the money from the Defense Department's budget to pay for it. There was no extra. There was even an agreement concluded between the Defense Department and NNSA that says when NNSA's budget goes over, the extra money comes from the Defense Department. It was a transfer agreement literally about the top line spending. Right? So you can make sure that every project that came through, DoD looked at in great detail and said, you've got to justify that this is necessary. So it meant that the parts of the modernization agenda and the choices that were made under Obama received a whole lot of scrutiny because of this funding mechanism and what you could think of as a shortage of dollars. Budget Control Act caps not really adhered to anymore, less concern about deficit spending. I mean, the Tea Party kind of went away in that sense. And this agreement to transfer money to link NNSA's budget to DoD's disappeared with the Trump administration. So as a result now, when NNSA goes over budget or proposes, say, a new warhead thing that they want to do, there's no reason for the Defense Department not to say yes, because it doesn't come out of their budget. Okay? Similarly, the Defense Department sets the military requirements for nuclear weapons, which then NNSA has to meet. Part of the problem in the past was that the Defense Department would set requirements without regard to cost, because they didn't have to pay for them. Well, the Budget Control Act and the budget agreement meant, in essence, yeah, if you set military requirements really high, you do have to pay for that. But that's now gone. Okay? So the concern is that a lot of the decisions that would have received greater scrutiny are receiving less scrutiny now because there's simply less oversight in the decision making, and that fiscal mechanism is gone. That contributes to strategic instability simply because a lot of things are done with less justification, with less transparency, with less discussion, and with less consideration for generating alternatives and weighing the pros and cons between them. Right. So this is my argument. 3 things. Strategic instability is worse because the line between conventional and nuclear is now easier to cross, because you've created the perception that the U.S. is interested in building more nuclear weapons potentially in the future, or at least creating the capacity that we could do so. And 3, because the scrutiny over choices now and in the future is less than it was because of the absence of this budgeting mechanism. So you add all these things together. And under the Obama administration, you had a nuclear modernization plan and strategic stability that was really based on the notion of mutual vulnerability. This is the political context. Okay? Same essential nuclear force posture, but within rhetoric about the notion that strategic stability comes because the US and Russia are going to be mutually vulnerable to each other, and that's why we need to reduce our arsenals more. Okay? So we would work towards renewed trust, future arms control agreements. Okay? Same nuclear structure, same nuclear modernization plans, but a different rhetoric under Trump suggests that the force structure of the United States and strategic stability means having more limited nuclear options, the ability to have an infrastructure that can expand to make more, and also the dollars that would fund these things, and that strategic stability for the Trump administration comes from making Russia alone vulnerable to the ability of the United States to have a greater nuclear force and a greater nuclear arsenal. And if that's the case, that lack of parity and similarity in treating the Russians, combined with any concern they may have that we actually have the capacity to build more and we might be more likely to use them, creates the classic situation for both crisis instability and general instability in an arms race.
Thanks for listening to Horns of a Dilemma. Be sure to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.